My nigga.
Say hello to my little friend.
I'm gonna make him an offer he can't refuse.
Keep your friends close, but your enemies closer.
Life was like a box of chocolates.
Moves pretty fast. You don't stop and look around once in a while, you could miss it.
Get busy living. You get busy dying.
The history of media in America has been wrought with a lot of racial stereotypes and undertones. Since the early onset of television, there have been a lot of instances of black erasure and whitewashing. To define these very briefly, whitewashing can be defined as the practice of removing visible minorities in popular media by making their skin appear lighter or even replacing them altogether with white actors. A prime example would be the Gods of Egypt movie, whose main cast was primarily composed of white actors, even though the movie is set in ancient Egypt. Meanwhile, black erasure can be described as the tendency to ignore, remove, or falsify black bodies and black voices. We saw this a lot more often in early media, where at times a white actor would play the role of a black character in what is known as blackface. A lot of times, these characters were portrayed as lazy, ignorant, superstitious, hypersexual, or prone to thievery and cowardice. Even today, modern media usually depicts minorities under a negative light, and they tend to fall under stereotypical categories. In this video, we'll analyze 3 main points: the limited roles of minorities in movies, the lack of diversity for shows with a minority cast, and the impact that these racial stereotypes have on people. Minorities seem to play very limited roles in American media, with a lot of their characters following a lot of overly dramatized racial stereotypes. In this section, we will look at what some of these roles are. Number 1. The best friend. Usually in films, we see minorities play the role of a best friend, and though it may sound like an important role, their characters tend not to be focused upon in the film. A good example would be The Devil Wears Prada, where actress Tracy Thoms plays the role of Anne Hathaway's friend. Not much detail is given to Thoms' character, and her primary role is to remind Hathaway's character of her values. As television executive Rose Catherine Pinckney told the New York Times, historically, people of color have had to play nurturing, rational caretakers of the white lead characters, and studios are just not willing to reverse that role. Number 2. The criminal. Perhaps one of the most common roles, the role of a criminal or thug is almost always played by minorities. Whether it be being a drug dealer, a terrorist, or a pimp, people of color are typically shown to engage in criminal activity in films. Movies like, take for example, this scene from Menace to Society. This is just one of the many ways that minorities play this criminal role, often portraying them as irrational or violent. 3. The help. It's no secret that minorities play a supporting role in film. This certain role is one which traces back to America's history of servitude, so it's no surprise that this is one of the most stereotypical roles. Nowadays, we see minorities have these roles as domestic workers, whether it be a maid or a butler or some other form. Like the black best friend, their primary role is usually to nurture, but sometimes they do play other major roles. In Made in Manhattan, Jennifer Lopez plays the lead role of Marisa Ventura, a hotel maid for whom a senatorial candidate, Christopher Marshall, falls for. There are a few other stereotype roles, but like these 3, they are mostly supportive. There's not much variety to the number of roles minorities tend to play in film. Not only in film, there's also a lack of diversity for shows with a cast primarily composed of people of color, which brings us to our next point. Television is known to have a large range of options, whether it be action, adventure, comedy, horror, you name it. But there's a large lack in the number of shows composed of minorities. Among those that do exist, a large number of them are mostly made up of African Americans or Latinos, with not much other variety. And to top it off, most of these shows tend to be comedies, with examples like The George Lopez Show or The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. Of course, if they're not comedies, then they're usually somehow related to crime. Prime examples like Empire or Power. But as previously mentioned, these are just shows featuring African Americans or Latinos. What about other ethnic groups? Well, according to research done by Dana Mastro in 2017, other ethnic groups get little to no exposure on television, aside from playing as foreigners or roles which are incredibly stereotyped or even racist. There are few, if any, shows that are primarily composed of these other groups, with some groups, like Native Americans, being essentially invisible on television. With this lack not only of diversity but also availability, this begs us to ask what implications this has on our culture, bringing us to ask, what impact does this have on the people? Well, for starters, television and film consistently seem to prefer the use of lighter-toned individuals to play stronger roles. Recall the concepts of whitewashing and black erasure that were mentioned earlier. This negatively impacts our views or preferences to favor those with lighter complexions. Also, the criminalization of those of darker skin, such as having them play the roles of a thug or a terrorist, alters us to believe that people of color are dangerous or distrustful. Take a look at this video.
Which doll is the pretty doll? Which doll is the nice doll? Which doll is the bad doll?
This simple test, known as the doll test, shows us how the portrayal of minorities in media contribute to this negative image where minorities is seen as criminals or even ugly. As you saw, even some of the children who were minorities had this negative image in their minds. This is because minorities are not given fair chances to be positive role models in the media. Viola Davis is the first black woman to win a Best Actress Emmy Award in a drama in 2015. This is what she said in her acceptance speech.
And let me tell you something. The only thing that separates women of color from anyone else is opportunity.
Modern media depicts minorities under a negative light. We can see this through the limited roles they have in films, the lack of diversity in shows with a minority cast, and how the public mentality is affected. We need to provide minorities with stronger roles to change this from happening. We've already begun to see this with the dawn of the movie The Black Panther, which has provided the public with a movie showcasing strong black roles. This is important because, as Jamil Smith says in Time magazine, relating to characters on screen is necessary not merely for us to feel seen and understood, but also for others who need to see and understand us.